Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to our 50th video of the Divine Order and the Universe Reading and Commentary series. Welcome, Tümerhan.
Good evening, everyone. Greetings from Adana.
This evening, we will read passages that explains the current states the humankind in, the scenarios behind the facade of the worldly appearances, and especially the topic of earthly cravings, sensuality, that selfish side of our duality unit. Sometimes, our dear friends ask clarification on this topic. This term expresses all states related to all sensual and earthly cravings we have, starting from the crudest carnal forms to subtler, hard-to-detect versions of ill thoughts, desires, selfishness, self-centeredness. But this term is not about ego.
As you said, this evening, our main topic will be the collisions or battles of the sensuality and the intuition of duty within the conscience duality. And, of course, we will discuss about widening of comprehension and knowledge of comparison, increase of the essence knowledge. We will try our best to give practical examples about these topics.
All right, let's start reading. Mankind may think of questions like, why this component of earthly cravings was necessary, or more correctly, would it not be possible to attain higher realities and to increase the essence knowledge and consequently, to fulfill the preparation for duty without the distinct duality of earthly cravings in human life? Answers to these questions have already been given in previous knowledge. Let us make them clear here. We have said that knowledge to be useful for the spirit's evolution has to become essence knowledge, that is, has to be the being's own property. And this is, as we have said, a quality that can be acquired only by the beings becoming molded by the events and making huge efforts. That is, the being will have some conclusions after the applications it will have through the body by struggling with world events in regard to their positive and negative aspects. And these conclusions will provide essence knowledge. Actually, repeated embodiments of mankind are for them to encounter the infinite manifestations of events, both bitter and sweet. The reason for this is to increase essence knowledge. However, here another imperative emerges as well. If the factors aiming the possibilities and opportunities of struggling with the events and getting molded by them do not exist, there would be no need for emergence of such demanding and effort-activating events. And if mankind could be made to advance on the evolutionary path with undeserved processes, then they could be imprisoned and dragged uncomprehendingly. However, the knowledge we previously gave indicates that such an evolutionary process cannot be possible. For such kinds of advancements which works like a complete machine irrelevant to the comprehension and freedom of beings, can only be subject to the principle of mechanical evolution, as we have previously explained, which has passed within the dark and infinitely long imprisonment at the initial stage of universe, when beings were yet devoid of comprehension and power. And the greatest result evolution under this principle provides for the beings, again as we explained, cannot go beyond the hydrogen atom's state of merit, which has not yet had comprehension and gained the powers to free themselves from imprisonment, and has been merely forced to adapt to mechanical motions. When the beings are put into events they have not deserved, they cannot gain benefits that are worthy for the stage of humanity. For in this case, at the manifestation of those events of which they cannot designate and appreciate the causes and effects, it will be impossible for them to be able to enter their knowledge of comprehension. And when there is no knowledge of comprehension, essence knowledge cannot be, and the evolution expected from humanity cannot be realized. Whatever the events may be, when their causes and effects are unknown to mankind, they remain vain and purposeless. Only the conclusions arrived at coming out victorious or defeated after being molded among the deserved bitter and sweet events, by the help of the knowledge of comparison on the face of the causality principle, can put into effect essence knowledge, which is the evolutionary factor. Therefore, mankind needs to be entitled to events which are regulated to their evolutionary needs so, by comprehending this entitlement, They can find the knowledge of comparison, which will take them to the conclusion while they struggle with those events, and they can attain the possibility of making an accounting of these. A child beaten, if he does not know the reason for this beating, cannot properly benefit from it. And when he cannot benefit from it, since he does not appreciate the degree of the situation, he cannot make efforts to improve his behaviors. In order for him to benefit from this beating, his comprehension needs to be awakened. For this, he needs to be informed about why and because of which weak sides of him he deserved this beating. And this can be possible by activating his weak sides that lie in wait and making these obvious. Moreover, this effort mechanism has a role in the application of the plan of fate, which we will explain later. This knowledge explains why some earthly craving parts, which will bring about some hard and harsh consequences, stand against the duty components, and why the beings in duty cause such situations. So, the mechanism of the duty earthly craving struggle is needed. And because of this, the earthly craving is a valuable factor on the path of development.
It is so interesting that this passage begins by the question of why this component of earthly cravings was necessary. We had talked about this necessity in our previous videos, but still, let's start by explaining this again. The earthly cravings or sensuality represents one of the opposites or poles in our conscience mechanism. The other pole is the reality of intuition of duty. These are like the trays of a vintage weighing scales. Last week, we had mentioned the collisions of these two opposing poles. Of course, this was an inner collision and its result manifests as either ease or uneasiness within us. And again, in the passage we read, it is stated that if there are times when we feel uneasy, miserable, ill-fated etc., then we need to orient ourselves toward the higher components of our conscience that we neglected so far. And as the result of this orientation towards, the effects and the drag of the sensuality's lower realities will gradually diminish. And, we must remember that, an application that previously used to be conscientious for us has not the same value now and becomes turning into a reality of earthly craving or sensuality. Well, let me think of a crude and aggravated example to make it clearer. Let's think of someone who generously helps people in need, and this is a very good application of conscience for him. However, his true intention is affected by the sensuality component, and even unbeknownst to him, he wishes to become a very well-known beneficiary, a celebrity with a golden heart. Yes, that person is making an application that affecting the higher components of his conscience, but as he advances, this celebrity status gradually becomes uncomfortable, evokes an uneasiness in him. In other words, this situation starts becoming a reality of earthly craving, of sensuality. If he can become aware of the reason of this uneasiness, he can change the direction, and continue helping people in need, without announcing his beneficiary deeds and actions. By doing this, he takes a conscious step upwards in the conscience mechanism. His previous application assumes a crude state for him when compared with the current application of conscience. In the next paragraph, we read this. Knowledge to be useful for the spirit's evolution has to become essence knowledge, that is, has to be the being's own property. At this point, we may need to talk about the knowledge of comparison and the synthesis of the essence knowledge. All of us know that our life is a system of events. Via our bodies, we collect the impressions of these events and transfer to our being. And the process of transferring from our being to our spirit is always ongoing. And, knowledge we gain from these events to be useful for the development of our being, we need knowledge of comparison, that is, knowledge we deduce from the results of events or from comparing the qualities of events. Gaining the knowledge of comparison may occur in sync with a given event, or may occur later in the linear time of our world. And I noticed that some of our friends consider this as a punishment, as in the old adage, a man doesn't die before he lives what he made others live through. Actually, such sayings contain the knowledge that a person must, and will, acquire the knowledge of comparison regarding the rightness or wrongness of the effects of his deeds in other people's life, as the cause and effect chains behind all those deeds. And this event isn't necessarily an exact replica of his deed. Let's imagine a person beating a stray dog with a stick. He does not need to be beaten by another person. No, it may be that there is a rusty piece of nail on that stick that scrapes his hand, and he infected with tetanus, and because he needs repeated injections for treatment, this may be his opportunity to understand the cause and effect chain leading him to this state and get a knowledge of comparison. Why this knowledge of comparison is important? Well, if we cannot properly gain the knowledge of comparison from and about the events we experience while we are alive in the world, it becomes harder to deduce the cause and effect chains that led us to making mistakes and wrong deeds after we die. Then, our spatium period and process become more confusing, suffering, and troubling. Because of this, knowledge of comparison is essential for us. And what we do with this knowledge of comparison and the impressions we acquired within a day? Last week I gave a simile. We transfer all this information as a compressed zip file to our being while we sleep at the end of a given day. And each day's information is stored at our unconscious, and when we die at the end of a lifetime, then the accumulated information is pushed into the subconscious, to be processed at the spatium period. There, in that field of isolated state, our being compares the recent knowledge of the last life with the essence knowledge gleaned from the previous knowledge and impressions of previous lifetimes, and after becoming completely comprehended by the being, this end result becomes the being's own property, and then, this is reflected to our spirit, and this allows the development of our being and the evolution of our spirit that advance in tandem. And if there is need for new and complementing, completing and consolidating experiences as possibilities to gain more knowledge of comparison, then a new life plan is outlined for our being with the help of our guardian beings and the beings in duty. Yes, another expression strikes my attention is, when the beings are put into events they have not deserved, they cannot gain benefits that are worthy for the stage of humanity. Then, they would be unable to gain their knowledge of comprehension. And when there is no knowledge of comprehension, essence knowledge cannot be, and the evolution expected from humanity cannot be realized. This is why we have freedom of choice as a result of the stage of human our beings reached. This is why we must learn noticing the cause and effect chains behind the events. As we make choices either from the sensuality component or from the intuition of duty component, these collisions between those choices bring out value differentiations all the time. When we look at from a wider perspective, yes, as humankind we live what we deserve, what our being and our spirit need. And, yes, without any exception, each of us reap what we sow with our choices. In another paragraph, we read this. Therefore, mankind needs to be entitled to events which are regulated to their evolutionary needs so, by comprehending this entitlement, they can find the knowledge of comparison which will take them to the conclusion while they struggle with those events and they can attain the possibility of making an accounting of these. And the book gives an example. A child beaten, if he does not know the reason for this beating, cannot properly benefit from it. Let's continue with examples related to children. For example, a child has a target to be successful in school. If she cannot do necessary work for this target, first, she feels uneasiness, and then, as her sense of responsibility gets activated, she feels regret because she inwardly knows and is aware that she didn't do what is necessary for reaching her target. If she ignores these signs of unease and continues in this path, she fails the exam. She is unsuccessful, off her target. And when she encounters this harsh result, her previous uneasiness now turns into pangs of conscience. Her soft spot of point of weakness in this situation is her failure for spending more efforts in regard to her sense of responsibility. And this is another important clue, mentioned in this passage like this. By activating his weak sides that lie in wait and making these obvious. In other words, we always must encounter our weak spots and weak sides that lie in wait, hidden from our sight. However, these weak spots and sides must be taken into the light, must become obvious. This mechanism of nudging or poking people at their weak spots is utilized by the beings in duty, to make us aware of our weaknesses. When we know about this mechanism and its purpose, interpreting the events we encounter, especially the events that trigger us into reactive actions, becomes easier. I have my own weak spots, you have your own weak spots. Each of us have weak spots, and exploring our inner world to discover those weak spots, and spending efforts for working on these so they become obvious, known, and hence, resolvable. Yes, such practices accelerate our advance in the path of development.
In this passage, I'd like to point out that the book refers to the amorphous matter, that initial state of matter which is inert and without form. Our dear friends can find related passages and detailed discussions on this topic in our previous videos, especially from Part 2 to Part 15. Still, let me briefly mention. This book begins with explaining how the inert matter gains motions by the original influence, arrives at from the original principle. And with this initial motion, an almost eternal period of mechanic and automatic stage begins for the novice spirits, and this stage gradually advances only with passive impressions. And here, we read in this passage that, if this freedom of choice was not given to the beings, or if there were not the dualistic choices from either two opposing sides oriented towards the knowledge of comparison and the value differentiation, then everything in the universe would be advancing just as it initially had in that dark and unknown period of mechanic and automatic stage of that amorphous state of matter. Yes, in the first 50 or 60 pages of this book, we read the entire process and progress, starting from the initial motion in matter as its respond to the original influence, and until the emergence of the being. Well, as stated in this passage, this mechanical evolution works as an entire machine, so, at the initial stage of universe, it was like an infinitely long imprisonment when beings were yet devoid of comprehension and power. And as beings gained comprehension and power in the following stages of plant, animal and finally human, they pass through instincts, automatisms, initial intuitions. And even in the stage of human, beings go through 500 to 700 lifetimes, so we are talking about incredibly long periods of time, of course, in our superficial linear time. Imagine the impressions and experiences that have been gained and widened the comprehensions. And in proportion to the scope of comprehension, a being has more agency, more power, more say in its future life plans. Therefore, we can say that the divine system allows us to become more and more comprehensive in every level of our existence. And to ensure this gradual but certain progress, we need to know every state of the beings. From the human perspective, this means that, within all those lifetimes, we need to assume many different and opposing roles in order to experience varying emotions in varying degrees with varying outcomes. In one life we are loved, in another life we are unloved. In one life we are the wise leader, in another life we are the unwise king. In one life we live in abundance, in another life we are dirt poor. Sometimes we live such opposite states within a lifetime. And yes, as you said, when seen from outside and from the narrow perspective of only one single lifetime's experiences, such states may look like eye for an eye, or encountering similar deeds in the cause and effect mechanism. Yet, this is how we learn, by knowledge of comparison. And of course, the consequences of our way of learning also lead to further causes and effects in accordance. You know that old adage, one bad thing is better than many advices. Yes, we gain profound lessons from one bad event, but the capacity for learning, mental and emotional structure of persons greatly vary. For example, one person learns a profound lesson just by observing a bad event without needing first-hand experience. Such a person observes, learns, notices his or her inner states, as well as external situations. And because he or she can make connection between the cause and effect of events, the choices he or she makes are more conscious, more toward the positive component of the conscience mechanism. In short, a person that uses comprehension and intuition as complementing mental and emotional tools. Yet, another person, without noticing the lesson a bad event brings along, only reacts to the event, let's say with anger and fury, and the already bad situation of the event may bring out more aggravated conditions, and that person finds himself or herself in the midst of unexpected situations and states. If that person becomes dominated by the emotions, then this may lead a frenzy that may end with badly hurting or killing some other person or persons involved in that event. Actually, such persons after the fact express the state they were in with interesting definitions. I lost my temper. I was beside myself. I was in a blind rage. Indeed, they lost their connection to their consciousness. They were not present in their body and become blind to reason. And such states may also occur with strong desires like lust, jealousy, fear, etc. Yes, even in these opposing states at the extreme ends of the pendulum, all those persons are living the experiences they need for their development, to complete the unfinished business from the past as well as the past lifetimes. After all, the divine order progresses to balance everything in the universe. In short, all those so-called bad events teach us lessons so we can break out from the prison of mechanic states, of our automatic states, both in the individual level and the communal level. Because then, we can be living, thinking, and acting consciously, with comprehension and conscience. And as it happens to individuals, sometimes, a whole nation has to encounter extremely bad situations and events, so can they become united by disregarding their previous conflicts and disagreements that caused by automatic states of that nation's members? And until human beings don't need such external influences from so-called bad events, but begin to widen their comprehensions and scope of their conscience with inner motivations and efforts, these tests and trials will continue, because, as we read the example of the child that gets beaten, if we don't know the reason for this or that bad event, we cannot properly benefit from it. And when we cannot benefit from it, we don't appreciate the degree of the situation, and consequently, we cannot make efforts to improve our behaviors. See, right now, as the whole humankind, as the community of the global village, we are going through this test and trial of this pandemic. A virus, invisible and weighing in total only 1 gr in all infected people, disrupted the social and economic status quo drastically. And now, the external enemy is this COVID virus, and automatically we enter the fight mode and try to fight as well, as much as we can. In the end, there will be either victory or defeat, but we don't consider another alternative. Yet, what about healing by transforming our inner states so we can harmonize with the virus? Yes, there are much subtler and finer levels in every state and reality. And until we wake up from our deep slumber and become more aware and able to see and live such subtler states, we will continue living the consequences of our choices made mostly automatically from the earthly cravings. That is, from the sensuality component of our conscience mechanism. And if we are overwhelmed due to repeatedly encountered harsh and bad events and conditions in our life, then instead of rioting and protesting, it may be the time to open our eyes to the state of our inner world. And the best way of doing this is asking ourselves questions. If in this divine order nothing is arbitrary, then what should I learn from those events? What do they try to tell me? As humankind, we replace the end with the means, hence, we forgot that all those means are just mechanisms and systems to carry them over some distances, but up to a certain point on the path of development. We cling to them or refuse to leave these means. Consequently, some harsher events happen, so we can loosen our grip, or to be separated from them. And yes, we observe that such events increasingly happen all over the world. Yes, whenever I read this book, and as you can imagine, I read and study it all the time, I see how precious this mechanism of opposite poles is, because in almost each passage of the divine order in the universe, I can feel this divine compassion that allowing human beings to progress. even with the choices they made from the earthly craving side, from the sensuality side. Yes, then, our progress becomes more gradual and maybe slower and definitely much harder, but regardless of the quality of our choices, we are still in the embrace of the divine system, because if we care to see, we are always provided with the possible states that can make us go out of the wheel of automatisms. I feel awe and wonder in the face of this providence. Personally, I see this world as a strongly built rolling mill, but the flour this mill produces is so fine, so top quality. The merit that is gained after becoming grinded by passing through all those arduous, painful, suffering stages of development will help us in passing to the plan of love. This is our next target, and we are getting closer to this stage every day. One of our dear friends asks, wouldn't it be nice if we, as seeds, not to be grinded in the mill, but to fall into the soil for the next regeneration as seedlings?
Well, the bricks and mortar of that rolling mill is our sensuality, the earthly cravings component of our developmentary mechanism. We must appreciate this rolling mill. It is not such a bad thing.
Yes, the mill is only another stage or phase. As a seed, we human beings have a potential. Let's say our beings sow us as seeds in this world. It may be that in one life or in many lifetimes, maybe we got rotten slowly or quickly and couldn't manifest this potential. Let's say, this time seed falls to the soil and activate that potential. We become a seedling, and as we grow to be a mature wheat ear carrying more and new potentials, we absorbed water and minerals from the soil by our roots and took in the influences from the sun by our leaves. We endured the extreme weather conditions, some adverse situations that happen around or to us. And these are the parts and parcel of the rolling mill we call the conscience mechanism that works with two opposing components. And in time, from that potential, a continuous state of ever-widening and revealing knowledge and comprehension emerges. And quality of the resulted wheat ear determines the weight and pressure of the rolling mill as well, because some wheat ears have very hard seeds, and some wheat ears have easy-to-grind seeds. And the harvest time comes for this matured wheat ear, but for our being that sow us in earth as seeds, the most important part to be harvested for its development is the essence of the all experiences of that wheat ear until it got matured. Because of this, all wheat seeds grinded in the final rolling mill until they become a very fine and smooth flour. And the hard parts and pieces that are not grinded properly will go through a sifter first, and then, if needed, through further grinding processes. Yes, as you said, dear Tümerhan. This rolling mill is very precious in grinding our initial crude states and matter combinations into ever subtler and finer versions as we advance in our path of spiritual development. It is always beneficial to look at outer world, as well as at our inner world from a much wider perspective. Because our habitual perspectives become narrow and narrower in the face of our real needs that pressuring us to widen our comprehensions. We need to set aside some time for self-reflection and meditation, preferably every day, even if for a short period of time. This will be helpful for us for widening our perspective.
Exactly. I'd like to add something to your words. At some point, we had said that we may not gain the knowledge of comparison related to an event within one lifetime. Well, we say that in the stage of human beings have 500 to 700 lifetimes until they complete this stage. However, because our being's time comprehension is spherical, all those lifetimes is like a single lifetime for our being, a single life. From this perspective, then, gaining the knowledge of comparison during separate lifetimes is out of question. For our being, it may be like gaining the knowledge of comparison within a single life. Birth and death of our world may be sleeping and awakening for our being. Because of these two different time comprehensions, interpreting this or grasping the cause and effect chains regarding this concept of multi-lifetimes is too hard for our superficial, that is, linear time comprehension we have in our bodily life. And if we don't study and deeply ponder on the knowledge given in this book so far, the rest of it will bring some tests and trials for us. I'd like to remind this to our dear friends. Please try hard to activate the intuition mechanism that exists in all of us.
Yes? Let's continue reading. In the developmental mechanism, the earthly craving standing against the duty component is not vain and unnecessary. The earthly craving is a perfect and fundamental vehicle, set in place for leading man to the knowledge of comparison, as we just have said, by whipping up the efforts with its whole and parts. Evolutionary mechanism will gain its ever-increasing speed across lives from the apparently negative powers of the components of earthly cravings. If the wood to be cut were not resistant, there would be no need to use an axe. The earthly craving is like the resistance of the axe, and the axe symbolizes the efforts belonging to the struggles to be done for overcoming this earthly craving. Therefore, if the earthly craving does not exist, there is no need for struggles and efforts. And when it happens, unmerited evolutions are expected to come one day, spontaneously. And, as we have just explained, such a thing is impossible. Therefore, the earthly craving must exist so the efforts to be able to pass to higher components may find the field of realization. These efforts are fundamental processes that allow knowledge of further stages, and their becoming the property of the essence being.
Here, again, the most outstanding part is the earthly craving is a perfect and fundamental vehicle, set in place for leading man to the knowledge of comparison, as we just have said, by whipping up the efforts with its whole and parts. And for the earthly cravings or sensuality, the book gives the example of hard wood. Well, hardness of the wood is a problem for us at first, isn't it? Yet, had not been hard and resistant, we could not cut it with the axe. We can see this in every field of life. For example, in the physics we find the force of friction. This is the force that opposes the applied force we use. The force that opposes, that is, that slows, decreases and even stops the applied force we use. Is this a bad thing? No, this is indispensable for us. Otherwise, every object we applied some force would be moving forever. There would not be a starting point and finishing point. This component of the conscience mechanism called earthly cravings or sensuality works in a similar manner. And it is in every point of our life, in varying degrees, and honestly, it waits to be seen with more comprehending eyes. Another example pops up in my mind. We can think our life in relation to this component of sensuality as a maze. This maze has infinite paths, and some of these paths lead us to our target, that is, to the exit. This maze has a peculiar property. Whenever we follow a wrong path, this path begins to narrow gradually, and we become squeezed from both sides as we try to go further. We begin to feel uneasiness. When this happens, we must be careful and try to understand the reason. This path will not lead us to the exit. So, we must change the path we walk on and try to advance, so see if this one is the right path for us. So, for the sake of this example, what brings out that squeeze is the path itself. Or another example related to how the needs turn into earthly cravings. Let's say there is a traveler who plans to go Istanbul from Adana. Of course, at some point he will get tired and hungry, and stop for a short rest to utilize the possibilities provided at this place. Let's say, there is a fruit orchard with many trees, full of different fruits. Our traveler gets attracted to this orchard. Yes, this is our traveler's need. He can enter the orchard to eat some fruits, this is his right. He enters, he picks and eats some fruits, and meets his need. Yet, when he begins to say, I want to stay here, I want to live here, then, some identifications with the orchard begin. However, he had a target. He would travel until he reaches Istanbul, but this orchard had attracted the traveler. Traveler changes his plans and decides to stay there for a very long time. Yet, a day comes and a sudden hurricane occurs and devastates the orchard. A flood comes and sweeps the orchard away. As a result, everything he assumed his own and indispensable are taken off his hands. Similarly, we must be careful about when our needs turn into earthly cravings we cling to. The only method to use for this is observing ourselves, the events we live and encounter, frankly and fairly.
And we see that in an earlier teaching we are told that we are responsible for our actions, and another teaching comes and tells us that we are also responsible for our thoughts. The second teaching reminds us that there are ever subtler levels of the sensuality component. There are very subtle versions of earthly cravings that are hard to detect. One of our dear friends asks, considering duality, do we place sensuality or earthly cravings against the conscience as its opposite pole?
Let me reply this briefly. This book names the developmental mechanism particular to the stage of human as the conscience mechanism. And, yes, in the duality of this mechanism, one pole is the intuition of duty, and the other pole is the sensuality or earthly cravings. And our reactions or response to the events we live are defined by the proximity of our reactions to the this or that pole. Yes, we name the rather positive applications as conscientious. However, if you remember, there are many levels in the developmental progress of a human being, and because of this, what is conscientious in one level can be sensual for the next level.
Yes, this can change from one level of our reality to its next level, or from my reality to your reality. I mean, if you like, you can say that opposite of sensuality is the altruism. If our friends read this book or watch our previous videos, then it will become clear that the concept of the earthly cravings or sensuality contain almost all degrees of human condition in regard to be in a physical body. This spectrum may begin with carnality, but as it gets balanced and elevated by the intuition of duty at the opposite pole, it transforms into self-centeredness, selfishness, etc., and eventually, it transforms into altruism, group responsibility, compassion, etc. And of course, this transformation occurs alongside the widening of comprehension. As our conscience gets developed, our comprehension widens in proportion. So, the path we follow takes us from the margins of the sensuality, and by getting you developed gradually, it carries us to the initial steps of duty. And there is only doing and becoming. Therefore, we are always spending efforts for our developments regardless the path we are on. Sometimes, what makes a human being walk a certain path is his or her taking care of the family, keeping the family's cohesion. For another human being, it is joining to a group or community for defending a cause, an ideal. For another human being, it is working and fighting for the country. For another, it is working for the betterment of humankind. However, even within the ever-widening scope of the conscience and intuition of duty, all those persons sometimes make choices from the sensuality component. Let's say, for feeding her own children, she turns a blind eye to other children's hunger. For defending his country, he commands his soldiers to die for ensuring victory. For inventing a very essential gadget, a person devotes his time to his invention, instead of his family, etc., etc. No need to make an endless list of examples. When we look at the general appearances of the humankind in this world, with all those imbalances and inequities, we can see myriad degrees of these two poles of the conscience mechanism. And because of this fact, we should evaluate the events happening to us within the level of our development and scope of comprehension. And we should not make judgments and have assumptions about other people and the events they live, because we don't know their being's level of development and what their needs are, because we cannot clearly see the dynamics behind their choices. That is why in the esoteric teachings, it is said that we are still walking towards to becoming true humans, because we are still not there yet. Human errs, because this right of making mistakes and learning from his mistakes is intrinsic, it is in his nature. Yes, let's continue reading. Now, we will provide knowledge pertaining to these earthly craving parts, and the state of a man who bustles and endeavors within the struggle of preparation for duty, in comparison with the realm he lives in as an individual. Man is a whole of combinations constituted with matter parts assigned to the being, which is the vehicle and expression of a spirit's evolution in universe. Therefore, the body is a vehicle assigned to service in the world for a being which can use it according to its developmental imperatives. The being influences the world matter through the body, which is under its governance and at its service, by utilizing its crude material state. These events occur in accordance with the superficial time reality to which the body is subject. On the other hand, influences coming from matter are reflected to the spirit via the channel of the being, by gaining in value from spherical time comprehension. In this way, the evolutionary needs of the spirit are fulfilled. The being uses the body for its test and trials, experiences, observations, in short, for all its needs, which are the necessities of its plan, and millions of assisting influences arrive at this body from outside, and of course, only via the channel of that being. These influences may come, as from the very high, from plans at various levels and stages of evolution as well, in order to put into effect results at various levels of intensity and power. All of these influences descending to the body in order to fulfill the necessities of the delineated plan of destiny, belonging to the being's bodily life in the world, are always under the control and supervision of higher plans. Therefore, none of these influences, from the smallest to the greatest, is in vain and unnecessary. Each of these displays states pertaining to the conscience mechanism that we previously talked about and is regulated in the organism. This regulation occurs in harmony with the necessities and imperatives of the being's plan for the world.
This passage is a perfect reply to the questions like what and why human body is. We read a complete summary of the relation of spirit, being and body. Of course, the concept of being is very important. We can, more or less, grasp what body is because when we look at a mirror or at each other, we can easily observe and experience the body. Yet, when we say being, it becomes hard to relate with it. Well, personally, I think naming this representative of the spirit as the being is not random. As the vehicle and expression of a spirit's evolution in universe, the being continues to be while governing a certain body, as well as when the being ceases its connection to that body. The being always is. Because, within the matter universe, all interactions of the spirit can only be done via this being. We read in this book that the purpose of the spirit is to learn the matter universe, but of course, we can only express this purpose in our worldly concepts and terms. And one of the lower levels of matter universe is the hydrogen realm, the cosmos. We have our corporeal, spatial and temporal existence. Indeed, we are beings that have bodies for a certain period of times. We must begin to define ourselves like this. Yes, for a certain period of time for each body. We call this a lifetime. We are beings that utilize bodies that exists within the frame of a lifetime. Our bodies belong to the hydrogen realm of the superficial and linear time. However, our being continues to be in the spherical time. In this passage, there is another important point. This special organ we call as brain, with its additional regions and consciousness centers that emerged at the stage of human, allows the interaction between the events that happen in the superficial time and the influences belonging to the being that continues its function in the spherical time. In other words, the being is the spirit's perceptual field and perceptual appearance or image in the matter universe. And we call this widening of this perceptual field as the development of the being, and the evolution of the spirit. And, if you remember what we have discussed about the essence knowledge in this reading and commentary series so far, the essence knowledge of the being does not get lost or erased because the being is subject to this spherical time comprehension. You know, in the hydrogen realm, everything has a beginning and an ending. However, in the spherical time the being exists in, or that governs the being, such beginnings and endings gradually become meaningless. We had mentioned this continuity and indefiniteness while we discussed the state of spatium. Yes, In this passage we clearly understand that the relation between the being and the body is via the brain, and we elevate millions of influences continuously coming to us, be it external, emotional, somatic etc. from the comprehension of superficial time, and transform these influences into the comprehension of spherical time via the channel of consciousness.
Thank you, you nicely summarized it. Well, another question came. Is it correct to consider the being as the hand of the spirit, and the body as the puppet moved by the hand?
In itself, this is a good simile, a nice composition of the visual images, but there is a problem with it, which is, the hands entering into the puppet. The being does not enter into a body. Beings governing a body is through induction, by sending influences via the channel of consciousness.
Yes, we must always remember that everything that happens and exists is an interaction of influences, interaction of magnetic fields, and these interactions occur via induction. I like to use a good example from Mr. Salt, a good metaphor or simile, to make things clearer. There is an ocean. Let's say this ocean is our hydrogen realm. There is a ship on the surface of this ocean. This ship's purpose is to probe deeper layers of the ocean, but this ship cannot dive into the ocean, the ship on the surface. This ship produces a robot or a probe boat and sends it down. That probe is directed by the signal sent from the ship. The probe goes deeper and collects data and materials and send all those information back to the mothership. In time, the probe gets broken or insufficient for further research. Then, mothership stops sending signals to the probe, and it becomes functionless. Another probe or robot is produced with larger capacity and new functions, and then is sent down. Yes, let's check the chat box for questions. Let me read one. Is it normal for the pain gets bigger when we pass from sensuality to conscience?
We gave an example of a student doesn't work for the next exam, to explain the uneasiness we feel whenever we are not on the right path or neglect our responsibilities. We can feel such uneasiness, but if our sensual side becomes dominant, we may continue disregarding this feeling, and in time, we become numb to it, we consider it normal. Yet, when we encounter with a harsh event which is the consequence of our disregard, we feel a shock. And if we understand that the lesson of this harsh event is the result of our earlier disregard of our uneasiness, then we can feel pangs of conscience. Such pain and suffering is an indication of our regret for disregarding the earlier signs, for shirking our responsibilities. A sign that we are becoming awake to and aware of this fact and this lesson. Otherwise, we would be keeping on to disregard that uneasiness, to shirk our responsibilities and moreover, to justify our selfish choice with many defense mechanisms. We wouldn't be feeling pain or pangs of conscience.
Another question. Aren't the things a human wants to gain his needs? If he don't acquire these things, then he wouldn't be meeting the needs of his being, and the purpose of his life plan would be in vain. Let's remember the difference between the true needs of the being and the desires and wishes of a human being. Tümerhan gave us a good example about a traveler and the fruits in the orchard. Yes, something is your need, however, life and the universe is cyclical and always in motion. Because of this, you cannot be connected to that need continuously, definitely. If you insist to remain connected to that need, then it becomes a sensual part of your reality. In other words, anything we want to have, own, acquire, or gain may not necessarily be need of our being. On the contrary, it may be our test and trial. From another angle, it is very possible that the things we avoid, things we escape from, may be our true needs. We need to look at this topic of needs from a wider perspective, because by saying I need this or that thing because it is my life purpose, etc., we may be in self-deception. We may be identifying with that thing we assume as our life purpose. Some people are identified with their body image. Some people are identified with their children, spouse. Some people are identified with their property, material gains. Some people are identified with the charity work they do to sustain their self-image. The list is endless. Yes, if there is some self-centered calculations or personal agendas in our actions, then they contain subtle sensuality, finer earthly cravings. And this is the point we must be very careful, especially when we assume we are doing good or better than others do. Yes, another question. Is the concept of soul we find in Michael Newton's books same with the concept of being we read in the divine order and the universe? Well, we can say yes, they are different words but expressing the same concept. Because the divine order and the universe defines the spirits as the supra-universe truths. And what termed as spirit or soul, in almost all spiritual literature, is actually the being, or the spiritual being. And in Michael Newton's books, we read many complementing information regarding the imaginative states and situations in the after-death. Thank you, dear friends, for these good questions. And thank you, dear Tümerhan.
Thank you, dear Tülin and dear friends. I wish, for all of us, a week full of patience and efforts.
Good evening, dear friends. Hoping to see you all next Monday,